My high school teacher warned me that the warmest smiles hide the sharpest knives, but it took a $40 million betrayal to realize his insane survival lesson was actually a warning for my life. I still remember the smell of Mr. Sterling's classroom, a mix of old parchment, stale coffee, and the sharp antiseptic scent of the whiteboard markers he used to scrawl warnings across the board. While other teachers were busy explaining the nuances of the Great Depression or the intricacies of the supply and demand curve, Mr. Sterling was teaching us something far more cynical. He called it survivalist economics. But to us high school seniors, it just felt like he was a bitter old man trying to ruin our youthful optimism. On the last day of the semester, he didn't give us a final exam. Instead, he sat on the edge of his mahogany desk, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk looking for a weak rabbit. He looked directly at me, maybe because I was the top of the class, or maybe because he saw a certain gullibility in my eyes, and said, "Mark, come here." I walked up, feeling the gaze of 30 other students on my back. He handed me a silver coin, a real silver dollar from the 1920s. "What's this worth?" he asked. "About $20 in silver melt value, sir," I replied confidently. He smirked, a thin, paper-dry expression. "It's worth exactly what the person buying it says it's worth until the moment you try to spend it. Remember this, Mark. The world is a stage of actors, and the ones with the warmest smiles are usually the ones hiding the sharpest knives. Trust no one, not your partners, not your friends, and especially not the people who tell you they love you for your potential. Verify everything. If you don't, you'll end up with a pocket full of lead disguised as silver." At 18, I thought he was insane. I thought he was a lonely, divorced man who had been burned by life and wanted to drag us down with him. I laughed it off, kept the coin as a memento, and went on to build a life that I thought proved him wrong. 15 years later, I was the CEO of a mid-sized software firm. I had the house in the suburbs, the sleek German sedan, and a reputation for being a visionary leader. My life was a testament to the power of networking and radical transparency. I believed in people. I believed that if you treated people with trust, they would return the favor. That was until Julian came back into my life. Julian had been my best friend in college. We were the duo that stayed up until 4 a.m. coding in the library, fueled by cheap ramen and the dream of being the next Silicon Valley titans. When I started my firm, Julian went his own way, moving into the world of venture capital and international high finance. We stayed in touch, but our paths drifted until he called me out of the blue 6 months ago. "Marky, I've been watching your numbers, man. You're killing it." Julian's voice boomed through the car speakers as I drove home from a late shift. "But you're playing in the kiddie pool. How would you like to take your firm into the stratosphere? I'm talking a 9-figure valuation within 18 months. I felt that familiar rush of ambition. Julian wasn't just a friend. He was a shark who knew where the blood was in the water. We met for dinner at an upscale steakhouse, where the lighting was dim and the bottles of wine cost more than my first car. He laid out the plan, a merger. His firm had been quietly acquiring smaller, specialized AI startups. He wanted my core infrastructure to be the brain of a new conglomerate called Aegis Systems. He showed me the projections, the letters of intent from Tier 1 investors, and the legal frameworks. It was flawless. On paper, I was about to become one of the wealthiest men in the city. "I need a commitment, Mark," Julian said, leaning in, his face glowing in the candlelight. He looked exactly the same as he did in college, just with a more expensive haircut. "I've got the Saudis and 2 New York firms breathing down my neck. They want in, but I told them I'm bringing my best friend first. This is for us. We're finally doing it." For the next 3 months, I was swept up in a whirlwind of due diligence, champagne toasts, and late-night strategy sessions. Julian was everywhere, at my house, at my office, even coming to my daughter's birthday party. My wife, Sarah, thought he was charming. My board of directors was salivating at the exit strategy. But then the ghost of Mr. Sterling decided to pay me a visit. It started with a small discrepancy. I was reviewing the final merger documents, thousands of pages of dense legal jargon. Most people would have just let the lawyers handle it, and my lead counsel, a man Julian had recommended, told me it was all standard boilerplate. But something about the way Julian had avoided eye contact when I asked about the liability indemnification clause triggered a memory. I remembered that silver coin. I remembered Mr. Sterling's voice. The ones with the warmest smiles hide the sharpest knives. I decided for the first time in my career to do something behind the scenes. I didn't tell my board. I didn't tell Sarah. I certainly didn't tell Julian. I hired a private forensic auditor from a firm 3 states away, someone with no ties to my industry or Julian's network. I sent him the Aegis Systems internal ledgers that Julian had shared with me during our transparent phase. A week passed. Julian was calling me every hour, pressuring me to sign the final papers. "The window is closing, Mark. If we don't ink this by Friday, the lead investors are walking. Don't blow this for both of us." I was sitting in my study at midnight, the pen literally hovering over the signature line of the merger agreement. My phone vibrated on the desk. It was an encrypted message from the auditor. It contained a single PDF file labeled discrepancy_report_final. I opened it, expecting to see a few minor accounting errors. Instead, the first line of the executive summary made the blood drain from my face. The report stated that the Tier 1 investors Julian had cited didn't exist. They were shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, all leading back to a single parent corporation. My heart hammered against my ribs as I scrolled down to the bottom of the report, where the auditor had traced the ultimate beneficiary of that parent corporation. It wasn't a Saudi prince. It wasn't a New York firm. The name at the bottom of the document was someone I knew very well, but it wasn't Julian. At that exact moment, my front door chime rang. My security camera app flashed on my phone. Standing on my porch, despite the late hour, was Julian. He wasn't smiling anymore. He was holding a heavy manila envelope, and he was looking directly into the camera lens with an expression I had never seen before. Cold, calculating, and predatory. "Mark." His voice came through the porch speaker, distorted and metallic. "I know you're awake. We need to talk about that audit you just commissioned. Open the door." My breath hitched in my throat as the name on the screen burned into my retinas. It wasn't a corporate entity or a faceless conglomerate. It was a name I recognized from the emergency contact section of my own personnel file, the Miller Vane Trust. Clarence Miller was my lead counsel, the man Julian had recommended, the man who had sat at my dinner table 2 weeks ago, laughing as he toasted to our inevitable success. The Vane part of the trust was even worse. Arthur Vane was a notorious corporate vulture, a man who specialized in hostile takeovers that ended in the total liquidation of the target company. He didn't build things. He stripped them for parts, leaving thousands unemployed while he bought another yacht. Julian was still standing on my porch, his face a mask of artificial patience. "Mark," he repeated through the intercom, his voice dropping an octave. "I know you're looking at the report. I know what you think you found, but you're only seeing half the picture. Let me in, and I can explain why Miller's name is on there. It's for your protection." I didn't move. I looked at the silver dollar sitting on my desk, catching the dim light of the lamp. "Verify everything," Sterling had said. "Protection?" I whispered, though I hadn't pressed the talk button. My mind was racing. If Miller was the beneficiary and Julian was the middleman, then the entire merger wasn't a growth strategy. It was a Trojan horse. They weren't trying to buy my company, they were trying to steal the intellectual property, the brain of the AI, and then bankrupt the shell that remained. My employees, my legacy, my life's work. It would all be vaporized within 48 hours. I finally hit the button. "It's late, Julian. We can talk at the office in the morning." "We don't have until morning," Julian snapped. The best friend persona was peeling away like wet wallpaper. The SEC filing is set for 8 a.m. If your signature isn't on the digital hard copy by then, the liquidity bridge collapses. You'll be personally liable for the bridge loan we used to float the Q3 numbers. You'll be bankrupt by noon, Mark, not the company. You. The room felt like it was spinning. The bridge loan. I had signed that document 3 weeks ago, under Miller's expert guidance. He had told me it was a standard formality to ensure we had enough cash on hand to satisfy the merger requirements. I hadn't looked at the fine print because I trusted Miller. I trusted Julian. "You set me up," I said, my voice trembling. "I saved you," Julian countered, his face leaning closer to the camera. "Vane was going to come for you eventually. This way you get a payout. A small one, sure, but you stay out of prison. Now open the door. We need to finalize the transfer of the encryption keys." The encryption keys. That was the final piece of the puzzle. Without those, the AI infrastructure was just a pile of useless code. They had the legal leverage, but I still held the keys. "Go home, Julian," I said, my voice firmer now. "I'm calling my own lawyers, not Miller." Julian didn't leave. He didn't even blink. He just looked down at his watch. "You have exactly 6 minutes before the default clause in the bridge loan kicks in, Mark. Once that happens, I don't need your signature. I just need a court order, which Miller already has drafted and ready to file with a friendly judge. But if you open this door, we can still make this look like a mutual agreement. You can walk away with your reputation intact." I cut the feed to the porch. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold my phone. I needed to call someone, but who? Miller was the enemy. My board of directors was likely compromised or too blinded by the promised payout to care. I scrolled through my contacts, my thumb hovering over the name of my head of security, but then I stopped. If Julian knew about the auditor I'd hired in secret, then he had someone inside my house or my digital network. My phone wasn't safe. My Wi-Fi wasn't safe. I looked at the silver dollar again. The ones with the warmest smiles hide the sharpest knives. I grabbed my laptop, disconnected it from the house network, and tethered it to an old burner phone I kept in the safe for emergencies. I needed to see exactly what that bridge loan clause said. I opened my encrypted backup drive, the one Julian didn't know about, and pulled up the scan of the document I'd signed. My eyes skipped past the legalese, searching for the default and liability sections. There, buried in a subparagraph of a subparagraph, was the poison pill. If the merger failed to close by the deadline, the lender had the right to seize all personal assets of the CEO as collateral. And the lender? It wasn't a bank. It was an LLC called S Dollar Holdings. S Dollar. Silver Dollar? My heart stopped. Mr. Sterling? Was this a joke? Was he somehow involved? No, that was impossible. He'd passed away 3 years ago. I looked at the registration details for S Dollar Holdings. It had been formed 20 years ago. The address listed wasn't a high-rise in Manhattan or a shell office in the Caymans. It was a small suburban address in my hometown, my old high school. I sat back, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Julian was still outside. I could hear the low rumble of a car engine, more than one. He hadn't come alone. They were waiting for the clock to hit midnight. They were waiting for me to be ruined. Suddenly, my laptop screen flickered. A new window popped up, bypassing my firewall as if it weren't even there. It wasn't Julian. It wasn't the auditor. It was a live video feed from inside my own living room. I looked up, staring at the empty hallway beyond my study door. In the video, I could see the back of my own head sitting at my desk. The camera was hidden in the smoke detector. On the screen, a text box opened over the video of me. "He's at the back door, Mark, and he has a key." I froze. I hadn't heard a sound. I slowly turned my head toward the study door, which led out to the main hallway. The house was pitch black, save for the glow of my monitor. Then, from the kitchen at the far end of the house, I heard it. The soft, unmistakable click of a deadbolt sliding open. My wife and daughter were upstairs sleeping. I grabbed the heavy silver dollar from the desk, my knuckles white. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a plan. All I had was the realization that I had let the monsters directly into my sanctuary. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate. They weren't Julian's polished Oxfords. These were boots. I reached for my phone to call 911, but the screen was dead. My laptop screen suddenly turned bright red with a single message flashing in white letters: "System override, privacy protocols disabled." The lights in my study suddenly flared to life, blinding me. "Mark," a voice said from the doorway. It wasn't Julian. It was Clarence Miller, my lawyer. He was holding a silenced pistol in one hand and a tablet in the other. He looked at me with a tired, almost pitying expression. "You really should have just signed the papers, Mark. Now we have to do this the hard way. Where are the keys?" I looked at him, then at the silver dollar in my hand. "The loan," I managed to croak out. "S Dollar Holdings. What is that?" Miller chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "That? That was the only part of this that wasn't our idea. That was a gift from a dead man who knew you better than you knew yourself. He set that up decades ago, waiting for the day you'd be stupid enough to trust someone like me." He raised the gun. "But he's not here to save you now. The keys, Mark. Or I go upstairs and wake up Sarah." Before I could respond, the house's integrated speaker system, the one connected to my smart home hub, cracked with static. A voice, distorted but hauntingly familiar, filled the room. "Actually, Clarence," the voice of Mr. Sterling echoed through the house, "I'm exactly where I need to be." The floorboards beneath Miller's feet suddenly gave way with a deafening crack. Clarence Miller didn't plummet into a dark abyss. Instead, the floorboards, engineered with a precision I never suspected, slid outward, catching his ankles in a mechanical vice. He screamed as he was jerked downward, his torso slamming against the hardwood while his legs dangled into the crawl space below. The silenced pistol skittered across the floor, sliding right to my feet. I didn't pick it up. I couldn't. I was staring at the wall-mounted speakers. "The silver dollar, Mark." The voice of Mr. Sterling crackled. It sounded like a recording, yet the timing was too perfect. Lesson number 4. A trapped predator is more dangerous than a free one. Do not approach. Check the coin. Miller was snarling, clawing at the floorboards, trying to haul his lower body out of the trap. "Mark, turn this off. You think this old ghost is going to save you? Vane has guys in the trees. Julian isn't alone." I backed away from Miller, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the silver dollar in my palm. I'd held this thing for 15 years. I'd used it as a fidget toy during board meetings, flipped it to make trivial decisions, and kept it on my nightstand. I'd always thought the weight was just the silver content. I looked closer at the rim. There, nearly invisible against the reeded edge, was a tiny indentation. I pressed it with my thumbnail. A soft hiss of pressurized air escaped the coin. The face of the Lady Liberty popped up like a lid, revealing a microscopic circuit board and a gleaming gold contact point. It wasn't just a coin. It was a physical hardware key, a cold wallet, or a master decryption token. "The encryption keys," I whispered. Julian hadn't been looking for a digital file on my server. He was looking for this. Suddenly, the front windows of the study exploded inward. Glass rained down in a glittering curtain. 2 men in tactical gear swung through the frames, landing with the heavy thud of professional killers. They didn't have the warm smiles Mr. Sterling had warned me about. They wore balaclavas and carried short-barreled submachine guns. Julian stepped through the front door a moment later, stepping over the threshold with a calm, terrifying gait. He didn't look like my college roommate anymore. He looked like a man who had already decided I was dead. "Enough games, Mark," Julian said, his voice echoing in the now breezy room. He ignored Miller, who was still pinned to the floor, cursing and sweating. Julian's eyes locked onto the opened coin in my hand. I didn't want it to be like this. I really didn't. But Vane is a very impatient man, and you've become a very expensive problem. "What is S Dollar Holdings, Julian?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. "Sterling set it up 20 years ago. How did you know about it?" Julian laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Sterling didn't just teach economics, Mark. He was the chief architect for the Vane Group's offshore structures before he grew a conscience and retired to a classroom. He stole $40 million on his way out. He hid it in a trust, waiting for a worthy successor. He chose you, and then he told us where to find it. He wouldn't, I said. He didn't have a choice, Julian countered, stepping closer. The two gunmen raised their weapons, the red laser dots dancing across my chest. We found him 3 years ago. He was old, Mark. Weak. We didn't even have to use much pressure. He gave us the name of the trust, but he wouldn't give us the key. He said he'd already given it to his best student. My stomach turned. Sterling hadn't just been warning me about the world. He had been passing me a target. The silver dollar wasn't a gift. It was a ticking time bomb. The AI you built, Julian continued, his eyes gleaming, it's brilliant. But it's not what Vane wants. He wants the $40 million Sterling stole. That money is tied to the $S bridge loan you signed. By signing that document, you unknowingly linked your company's assets to Sterling's hidden stolen hoard. If you hand over that coin, the merger goes through, the $40 million is laundered back to Vane, and you get to live in a nice little house in the country with your family. If you don't, he gestured toward the ceiling, my man is already at your daughter's bedroom door. The world seemed to tilt. I looked at the coin. I looked at the gunman. I looked at Miller, who was now sobbing in pain as the mechanical trap tightened on his legs. Trust no one, the voice in my head, the real Sterling, the one from the classroom, whispered. Verify everything. I looked at the gold contact point on the coin. Then I looked at my laptop. You want the money, I said, my voice cracking. Fine, but I need to authorize the transfer through the $S portal. The coin alone won't do it. It needs a biometric scan from the original trustee's terminal. Julian hesitated. His greed was battling his caution. He nodded to the gunmen who lowered their sights just an inch. Do it, fast. I moved to the laptop, my fingers flying across the keys. I wasn't accessing a bank. I was accessing the house's core logic. If Julian was telling the truth, Sterling had been a criminal. But if Sterling was a criminal, why would he leave me a recorded warning tonight? Why would he trap Miller? I realized then that Julian was lying about one thing. Sterling hadn't given them anything. The old man had used himself as bait to lead the wolves into a trap he'd been building for 20 years. I swiped the coin across the laptop's sensor. "Mark, what are you doing?" Julian asked, his voice sharpening. He moved toward me, sensing the shift in the air. The screen didn't show a bank transfer. It showed a map of the house glowing in neon blue. "Lesson 11, Sterling's voice boomed again, no longer distorted but crystal clear and vibrating with power. The best way to win a fight is to make sure your opponent doesn't know what floor they're standing on. The entire house shuddered. A deep mechanical groan vibrated through the foundation. "Julian," I said, looking him dead in the eye, "you said Vane's man was at my daughter's door?" I hit the enter key. Across the house, a series of high-velocity steel shutters slammed down over every window and door, sealing us in. But it wasn't just a lockdown. The floor beneath Julian and the two gunmen began to hum. "The bridge loan," I said as the floor beneath them began to tilt at a 45-degree angle, sliding them toward the center of the room. The collateral wasn't my company. It was the house itself. Suddenly, the ceiling of the study opened up. But it wasn't my daughter's bedroom above us. It was a void of darkness. A heavy, industrial-sized shipping container, hidden within the very structure of the house, descended from the rafters, hovering just inches above our heads. "Mark!" Julian screamed, sliding toward a recessed pit that had opened in the floor. "Stop this! We'll all die!" The voice of Mr. Sterling returned, cold and final. "Final exam, Mark. You have 10 seconds to decide who leaves this room. The exit is behind the desk, but to open it, you have to leave the coin behind." I looked at the exit, a small panel in the wall that had slid open. Then I looked at the shipping container. On its side, painted in white, was the logo of the Vane Group. The container began to hiss, a green gas leaking from its seams. "Mark, please," Julian begged, his fingers slipping from the edge of the pit. I looked at the coin in my hand. Then I looked at the man who had tried to destroy my life. The 10-second countdown appeared on my laptop screen. 5, 4, 3. I lunged for the exit, but a hand reached out from the shadows of the hallway, a hand I didn't recognize, and grabbed my ankle, pulling me back into the center of the room just as the shipping container's doors began to swing open. The hand around my ankle felt like a shackle of cold iron. I kicked out, my heel connecting with something soft, a nose, a jaw, and heard a grunt of pain. I scrambled back, gasping for air as the green mist began to swirl around my knees. "You're not going anywhere, Mark," a voice rasped. It wasn't the metallic tone of the speakers or Julian's panicked whine. It was Hendricks, my head of security. He crawled out from the shadows of the hallway, blood streaming from his nostrils, his eyes wide with a terrifying, drug-induced zeal. "Vane promised me 10%. 10% of $40 million is worth more than any salary you ever paid me." "Hendricks, the gas!" I shouted, pointing at the hissing container. "We're all gonna die in here." "It's not poison, you idiot," Hendricks spat, wiping blood on his tactical vest. "It's halon. It displaces oxygen. It's meant to protect the servers in that container. We won't die. We'll just go to sleep. And when we wake up, Vane will have what he needs." I looked at the container. The heavy doors had fully hissed open, revealing not a pile of gold or stacks of cash, but a humming, glowing wall of black glass and fiber optic cables. It was a localized supercomputer, a dark server that hadn't been touched in 2 decades. The S-dollar isn't a bank account, I realized, the air in my lungs already beginning to feel thin and useless. It's a ledger. A history of every bribe, every offshore transfer, and every shadow deal the Vane Group has made since the 90s. "It's the leverage," Julian gasped, dragging himself toward the container, his movements slow and heavy as the oxygen levels in the room plummeted. "With that ledger, Vane can buy the government, or he can be executed for treason. He's not here to collect his money, Mark. He's here to burn the evidence." The room was tilting. My vision began to fray at the edges, turning gray and fuzzy. I looked at the silver dollar in my hand. The gold contact point was glowing faintly, reacting to the proximity of the server. "Lesson 12, Sterling's voice returned, though it sounded further away now, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Information is the only currency that doesn't depreciate, but it's also the heaviest burden to carry. Mark, look at the monitor." I forced my leaden head toward the laptop. The map of the house had changed. A new room had appeared, located deep beneath the foundation, a reinforced bunker I never knew existed. On the screen, 2 thermal signatures were huddled together. Sarah, my daughter Lily. "They're safe," I whispered, a surge of relief cutting through the fog of the halon gas. "For now," Miller's voice came from the floor. He was barely conscious, his face a pale shade of blue as he struggled against the trap holding his legs. "But the bunker, it's on the same circuit as the server. If the server is destroyed, the ventilation for the bunker shuts off. If the server is extracted, the bunker locks from the outside. Vane designed it that way. A failsafe." Julian was at the server now, his hand trembling as he reached for a port. He had a data thief device in his hand, a small black box designed to suck the server dry and then fry the hardware. "I just need the keys, Mark. Give me the coin and I'll open the bunker. I'll let them out. I just want the ledger gone so I can get paid." I looked at the coin. I looked at Hendricks, who was trying to stand but collapsing under the weight of the thinning air. I looked at the shipping container, the heart of a dead man's revenge. Mr. Sterling hadn't saved me. He had placed me in the center of a scale. On one side, the truth that could take down a monster like Arthur Vane. On the other, the lives of the only people I ever truly loved. "Mark?" Julian's voice was a wheeze. He was slumped against the server rack. "The oxygen. 3 minutes. That's all we have. Give me the coin. Save your family. Verify everything, I muttered to myself, my brain struggling to function. Verify everything. I looked at the coin's internal circuit. There was a small serial number etched into the gold contact. S-00-11-20, November 20th. That was the day of our final exam, the day he gave me the coin. I looked at the server's interface. There was a single physical slot shaped exactly like the silver dollar, but next to it, there was a small, manual lever painted bright red. "Julian," I croaked, "if you use that box, the bunker seals forever. You know that, don't you? Vane told you to kill them." Julian didn't answer. He just held out his hand, his eyes pleading. "The coin, Mark. Please, I don't want to die." I had a choice. I could give him the coin, let him wipe the server, and hope he was telling the truth about the bunker. Or I could use the coin myself, activate the ledger, and broadcast Vane's crimes to every news outlet and federal agency in the world. But if I did that, the server would draw maximum power, and according to Miller, that would trigger the bunker's permanent evidence protection seal. My family would be entombed in the dark while I became a hero. "Mark!" a new voice screamed. It wasn't a recording. It wasn't Julian. It was coming from the vents. "Mark, don't do it. Don't give him anything." It was Sarah. She wasn't in the bunker. Her voice was coming from the ceiling. I looked up. The thermal signatures on the laptop were a lie. A digital loop fed into the system to manipulate me. "Where are they?" I screamed at Julian, lunging forward and grabbing his collar. "Where are they?" Julian smiled, a horrific, oxygen-deprived grin. "I told you, Mark, the world is a stage of actors. You spent 15 years thinking Sterling was the villain. You spent 10 minutes thinking I was the villain." He pointed a shaky finger toward the front door. Through the reinforced glass of the shutters, I saw a black SUV pull into the driveway. A man stepped out. He was tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed. He looked exactly like the photos of Arthur Vane, but he was carrying a small, handheld remote. The man walked up to the shuttered window and pressed the remote. The speakers in the room hummed to life one last time. "Excellent work, Julian," the man said, "and thank you, Mark, for keeping the key so safe all these years. Now, if you'd like to see your wife and daughter again, you'll put the coin in the slot and pull the red lever. Not the data thief, the lever." "What does the lever do?" I asked, my heart stopping. "The lever," Arthur Vane said, his voice smooth as silk, "initiates the house's self-destruct. It's the only way to open the front door from the inside. You have 60 seconds to choose. The ledger, your life, or theirs." I looked at the red lever. I looked at the coin. Then, I noticed something Julian hadn't seen. On the very bottom of the silver dollar, hidden under the lid I had popped open, was a tiny, handwritten note in microscopic script. I held it up to the glowing light of the server. "Mark, the coin isn't the key. It's the fuse." I looked at Arthur Vane through the glass. I looked at the red lever, and then I realized what Mr. Sterling's final lesson really was. I didn't put the coin in the slot. I threw it. Not at Julian, but directly into the spinning, cooling fan of the supercomputer. A shower of sparks exploded from the server. The lights in the house flickered and died, plunging us into total darkness. "Mark, what did you do?" Julian shrieked. The house began to groan. Not a mechanical groan this time, but the sound of structural failure. From outside, I heard Arthur Vane scream. A sound of pure, unadulterated terror. I felt the floor beneath me vanish. I wasn't falling into a trap. I was falling into the one place I never thought to look. As I hit the cold water of an underground cistern, the last thing I saw before the house above us collapsed was the red light of the server rack turning green and a message appearing on my burner phone's screen. "Upload complete. Goodbye, Arthur." But as I broke the surface of the water, gasping for air, I realized I wasn't alone in the dark. Someone was breathing right behind me. You always were a slow learner, Mark. A voice whispered in my ear. It was Mr. Sterling, and he was holding a knife to my throat. The blade was cold, a thin line of icy pressure against my jugular. The water in the cistern was black and stagnant, reflecting nothing but the flickering red light of my phone, which was still clutched in my shaking hand. Above us, the muffled roar of the collapsing house sounded like a dying beast, the weight of my former life settling into a tomb of splintered wood and crushed concrete. "Don't turn around," Sterling whispered. His voice wasn't the metallic recording from the speakers. It was raspy, wet with age, and terrifyingly real. "If you turn around, you'll try to see the man instead of the lesson. And the man is just a ghost, Mark. A ghost who had to die so you could live." "You're alive," I choked out, the water lapping at my chin. "The funeral. The obituary." "Theater, Mark. Pure theater. I told you, the world is a stage. I needed Vane to believe the shepherd was gone so the wolf would feel bold enough to walk into the pen. I knew they'd come for you. I knew they'd use Julian. I taught him, too, remember? But Julian only learned the greed. He never learned the caution." The pressure of the knife eased just a fraction. "The coin," Sterling continued. "You threw it into the fan. Why?" "Because you said it was a fuse," I said, my voice gaining strength. "And because I realized that if Julian wanted it so badly, it was the one thing I couldn't let him have. If I'd put it in the slot, I'd be a pawn. By destroying it, I became the wrecking ball." I heard a dry, rattling chuckle behind my ear. The knife retracted completely. "Grade, A+. The coin wasn't a key to a bank, Mark. It was a physical bridge. The server was air-gapped, totally disconnected from the internet to keep it safe from hackers. The only way to get the data out was to create a catastrophic hardware failure that would force the system to dump its memory into the emergency cloud link I'd hidden in the house's wiring. You didn't just upload the ledger. You detonated a digital nuclear bomb in the center of the Vane Group." I finally turned around. He looked older, much older. His hair was a thin white fringe, and his face was a roadmap of scars and deep-set wrinkles. He wasn't wearing the sharp suit of a corporate architect. He was wearing tattered fishing gear, looking like any other old man you'd pass on a pier and never think twice about. "Where are they, Sterling?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. "My wife. My daughter." Vane said, "Vane says a lot of things. He's an actor, Mark. A very good one. But I'm the director." Sterling gestured toward a rusted iron ladder leading up to a concrete shelf. "Follow me and keep your phone off. The signal is being tracked by people who aren't as friendly as the FBI." We climbed out of the cistern and moved through a series of narrow, reinforced tunnels that smelled of earth and old copper. These weren't part of my house's original plans. They were older, remnants of a forgotten civil defense shelter that Sterling must have spent years secretly connecting to the property. At the end of the tunnel was a heavy steel door. Sterling punched a code into a keypad, not a digital one, but an old mechanical tumbler. The door swung open to reveal a small, dimly lit room filled with monitors, canned goods, and a single wooden table. Sitting at that table, wrapped in gray blankets and holding mugs of steaming cocoa, were Sarah and Lily. "Daddy!" Lily shrieked, sprinting toward me. I collapsed to my knees, pulling her into my arms, the terror of the last few hours finally breaking into a sob. Sarah was there a second later, her face pale but her eyes fierce. "They picked us up 3 hours ago," Sarah whispered into my neck. "Men in suits. They said they were with your security team, but they took us here instead. I thought we'd been kidnapped, Mark. I know," I said, looking over her shoulder at Sterling, who was standing by the monitors watching the news. "I thought the same thing." On the screens, the world was ending for Arthur Vane. The $S leak was being called the heist of the century. Documents were flashing across the screen, proof of money laundering, political assassinations, and the systematic gutting of dozens of American companies. I saw Julian's face in a mugshot, captured by police as he tried to crawl out of the ruins of my house. Clarence Miller was being wheeled into an ambulance in handcuffs. and Arthur Vane. He had been arrested on his own front lawn, still clutching the remote that had failed to save his empire. "The financial ruin," I said, looking at the screen and then back at my teacher. "My company is gone, Sterling. The house is a hole in the ground. My reputation is tied to a man who just got outed as a monster. I'm broke. I've lost everything." Sterling walked over, his eyes softening for the first time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another coin. It wasn't silver. It was a simple copper penny, worn smooth by time. "Look at the monitors again, Mark. Look at the names of the victims." I looked. The ledger didn't just list Vane's crimes, it listed a massive trust fund, the Sterling Mark Recovery Fund, that had been automatically funded by Vane's own seized offshore accounts the moment the fuse was lit. It was a legal mechanism Sterling had spent 20 years perfecting. Because Vane had signed the merger papers using the S-Dollar shell company, he had unknowingly legally transferred the bulk of his liquid assets into a trust that was now, by law, owned by me. "You aren't broke, Mark," Sterling said. "You're the wealthiest man in this city, and more importantly, you're the only one with a clean soul." He handed me the penny. "Why the penny?" I asked. "Because the silver dollar was a lie," Sterling said with a wink. "A shiny distraction to keep the greedy men focused on the wrong thing. A penny is honest. It's worth exactly what it says it is. It doesn't pretend to be silver." He walked toward the exit of the bunker, his silhouette fading into the shadows of the tunnel. "Where are you going?" I called out. "To be dead again," he replied. "It's much quieter that way. Just remember the final lesson, Mark, the most important one." "What's that?" "Trust no one," he said, his voice echoing back to me. "Except for the man who taught you that you can't even trust him, because he's the only one who ever told you the truth." I watched the door close, the heavy thud of the bolt echoing in the small room. I looked at the penny in my hand, then at my wife and daughter. My firm was gone. My house was a ruin. I had $40 million in a trust and a target on my back that would last a lifetime. But as I sat there in the dim light of a hidden bunker, listening to the breathing of the two people who meant everything to me, I realized that Mr. Sterling was right. I had been saved from ruin, not the kind that shows up on a balance sheet, but the kind that rots a man from the inside out. I looked at the penny one last time before tucking it into my pocket. It wasn't silver. It wasn't gold. But in that moment, it felt like the most valuable thing I had ever owned. I had finally learned to verify everything. And what I verified was that I was finally, truly free.